It was a cold, foggy night on the deserted English countryside. Mark, a seasoned driver, found himself on a desolate road, a shortcut he thought would save him time on his long journey home. The eerie silence was only interrupted by the hum of his engine and the occasional hooting of an owl in the distance. As he navigated the narrow, winding road, Mark felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, and a sense of dread hung in the air. Trying to reassure himself, he turned up the volume of the radio, hoping that the sound of music would drown out his unease. However, the radio signal was weak, and snippets of static filled the car. Mark's heart quickened when he thought he heard a faint, haunting voice whispering through the radio waves. He strained to listen, but the words were indecipherable, sending a shiver down his spine. Deciding that he was merely imagining things, Mark pressed on. But as he rounded a sharp bend, his headlights illuminated an ethereal figure standing in the middle of the road. He slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt just inches from the apparition. A woman in a tattered, white dress stood before him, her eyes hollow and distant. Her skin was pale, and she appeared to be drenched in water, as if she had emerged from a nearby lake. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he rolled down his window, hoping to help the stranded woman. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice trembling. The woman did not reply, but instead beckoned him to follow her. Her bony finger pointed towards a path leading into the dense woods. Mark hesitated, his instincts warning him of impending danger, but he felt a strange compulsion to obey. Against his better judgment, he stepped out of the car and followed the mysterious woman into the eerie forest. The fog thickened around them, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Yet, Mark kept walking, the woman always just a few paces ahead of him. As they walked, the woman's presence seemed to grow colder and more sinister. The air around Mark felt heavy, and he began to feel disoriented, losing track of time and direction. He called out for help, but his voice seemed to vanish into the mist. Suddenly, the woman vanished from sight, and Mark found himself alone in the heart of the sinister woods. Panic set in, and he tried to retrace his steps, but every path seemed to lead him deeper into the darkness. Fear consumed him, and he felt as if an invisible force was pulling him further away from safety. Then, in the distance, Mark saw a faint glimmer of light. Desperate for rescue, he followed the beacon, stumbling through the underbrush until he reached an ancient, abandoned house. The light seemed to emanate from within, luring him like a moth to a flame. Cautiously, Mark entered the decaying building. The air was thick with dust and the smell of rot. He heard faint whispers and eerie laughter echoing through the dilapidated halls. Fear clutched at his heart, but he couldn't resist the call of the light. As he approached a decrepit staircase, the whispers grew louder, and a chilling wind swept through the house. Mark glanced up the stairs and saw the woman again, standing at the top, her lifeless eyes locking with his. His breath caught in his throat, and he couldn't tear his gaze away. Without warning, the woman let out a blood-curdling scream, and the house seemed to come alive. Doors slammed shut, objects flew across the room, and the temperature plummeted. Mark tried to escape, but an unseen force held him in place, trapping him in the ghostly nightmare. In a desperate bid for survival, Mark closed his eyes and mustered all his strength to break free. With one final burst of energy, he tore himself from the ghostly grip and ran towards the exit. The house seemed to fight back, but he managed to burst through the door and into the night. He sprinted through the woods, guided by the dim moonlight, until he reached his car. Without hesitation, he started the engine and sped away from that haunted place, vowing never to return. To this day, Mark shudders at the memory of that chilling encounter. Whether it was a ghost, a malevolent spirit, or his own imagination playing tricks on him, he could never be sure. But one thing was certain, he would never forget the night he drove through the haunted highway of the English countryside. The fog settled over the narrow country road, casting an eerie shroud of darkness over everything it touched. John, a weary traveler, gripped the steering wheel of his car as he navigated through the ominous mist. The low hum of the engine and the rhythmic whirring of the windshield wipers were the only sounds that punctuated the silence of the night. As he drove, John's mind wandered back to the warnings he had received earlier that evening at a nearby inn. The locals had spoken in hushed tones about the dangers of driving on this particular road after dark. Tales of ghostly apparitions and fatal accidents haunted the stretch of highway that cut through the desolate moors. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the radio, trying to distract himself from the growing unease. A faint melody filled the car, but it only seemed to amplify the sense of foreboding. John decided to switch it off, preferring the enveloping silence to the haunting tune. With every passing mile, the fog thickened, reducing visibility to a mere few meters ahead. He squinted, straining his eyes to pierce through the murky darkness. Suddenly, his headlights caught a fleeting figure on the side of the road. A young girl, drenched in rain, appeared out of nowhere, her pale face barely visible through the mist. Startled, John slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car came to a halt. He felt a chill run down his spine as he hesitated, contemplating whether to help the girl or not. Something felt off, unsettling, about the whole situation. But he couldn't just leave her there alone in the cold night. With trepidation, he stepped out of the car and approached the girl. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" he asked with concern in his voice. The girl remained silent, her eyes fixed on him, hollow and vacant. Then, in a ghostly whisper, she muttered, "He's coming." John's heart pounded in his chest, but he brushed it off as a product of his own fear. "Who's coming? Is there someone else out here?" he inquired, glancing around nervously. "He's coming for you," she repeated, her voice growing more sinister. Before he could respond, the girl's eyes rolled back, and her body contorted in an unnatural manner. Panic surged through John, and he stumbled backward, retreating to the safety of his car. Slamming the door shut, he quickly turned on the engine and sped away, leaving the terrifying apparition behind. As he continued along the road, his mind replayed the unsettling encounter over and over. But the worst was yet to come. In the distance, he spotted a dim light, flickering like a beacon amidst the darkness. Approaching cautiously, he saw an old, dilapidated inn that looked as though it had been abandoned for centuries. Against his instincts, curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to investigate. The moment he stepped inside, a chill gripped his bones. The air was heavy with a cold, palpable malevolence. Dust-covered furniture creaked, as if haunted by invisible forces. And cobwebs hung like shrouds in every corner. A voice echoed through the empty halls, beckoning him further into the abyss. John followed the eerie whispers, drawn like a moth to a flame, until he reached the inn's darkened basement. The oppressive silence was broken by a series of blood-curdling screams, reverberating through the cold, damp air. His heart pounded in his ears as he descended the creaky staircase, guided only by the dim light of his phone. He froze when he saw a ghastly figure, clad in tattered clothing, with a face so twisted in agony that it sent shivers down his spine. The ghostly figure pointed to a pile of bones in the corner, and John's breath caught in his throat as he realized they were human remains. The sinister truth dawned on him. He had stumbled upon the site of a long-forgotten tragedy, and the girl he encountered was but one of the many lost souls trapped in this accursed place. With a growing sense of horror, he understood that the apparitions along the road were the victims of a terrible accident. Forever doomed to warn unsuspecting travelers, filled with dread, he tried to escape the haunting basement, but the door slammed shut, trapping him within its suffocating walls. The ghostly figure inched closer, its anguished wails deafening in the confined space. Desperate to survive, John reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, antique locket he had found earlier. As he held it aloft, the ghostly figure hesitated, its mournful expression briefly softened. With a desperate plea, John offered the locket as a symbol of remembrance and closure. The atmosphere in the room shifted, and the apparition began to fade, slowly dissipating into the shadows. in that moment, the door creaked open. And John made his escape, racing back through the darkened inn and out into the fog-shrouded night. The haunting experience forever etched in his memory. He would never forget the spine-chilling night that reminded him of the dangers lurking on forgotten roads, where the spirits of the past still wandered, seeking solace in the living world.